Welcome to our fourth class in Old Testament, Hebrew Scriptures. And so this particular short talk is going to be about the former prophets primarily, though we're entering into our section in the class on the former and latter prophets. I have to confess, I do not typically think of the books that are identified as former prophets as all that prophetic. So we need to discuss briefly what books are classified as former prophets and what books are classified as latter prophets, and why they are so classified, and what difference does it make how we classify these particular biblical books or any of the biblical books. So let's start with a definition of former prophets. The former prophets are those books in the Bible that come before the prophetic books. So the word former here is being used like before, as in the former days. Which books are the former prophets? Joshua, Judges 1 and 2, 1 and 2 Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings. What do these books in the Bible cover or address? What are they generally about? The former prophets tell us about the people of Israel from the conquest of the Promised Land under Joshua, that's in the book of Joshua, through the tribal confederation in the book of Judges, to the rise of the united monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon, 1 and 2 Samuel. Then they tell the story of the divided monarchy between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and the eventual exile of first the northern kingdom of Israel and then the southern kingdom of Judah. That's in 1 and 2 Kings. Then 1 and 2 Chronicles tells much of the same story, mostly starting with David, the division that leads to exile, and ending with King Cyrus of Persia ordering the rebuilding of the temple. So that's the former prophets. The latter prophets are the 15 books that come after the former prophets that run through Isaiah, from Isaiah through Malachi. Which books are the latter prophets? The three major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then the 12 minor prophets. And here you can just go to a Bible and you can see them running right after another. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. These are the books that most people typically think of as prophetic, with the stories and teachings of prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Micah and Malachi, etc. So how are those former prophets prophetic? Here we get into some of the differences between Jewish and Christian views of the purpose of prophecy. This was discussed in your textbook. The Jewish view is that prophets are those who come after the Torah, those first 5 books of the Pentateuch that we've been talking about up to this point. And they interpret the Torah for the ongoing life of the people. So they're making sense of the Torah in the life of the people of Israel. The Christian view is that prophets not only interpret the Torah for God's people, they also point forward, particularly to Jesus and to the coming of the Spirit and the reign of God. So check in your textbook on page 104 for a little bit more elaboration on that. Now, does the classifying of the books of the Bible help us to understand and interpret what we are reading? Well, maybe. Christians organize the Old Testament into 4 main sections: the Pentateuch, the historical books, the wisdom books, and the prophetic books. In Judaism, Daniel and Lamentations go into the writings, along with the writings that include Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Esther, Ruth, and wisdom books like Proverbs, Job, and the Psalms. So what difference does this all make? I mean, you can go and you can Google classification of the books of the Bible, but what difference does it make with where we put one book compared to another? Well, we already saw the difference in our thinking about prophecy. In the Jewish view, prophecy kind of looks back to a golden age that we're now to live into in the present. In the Christian view, prophecy points more forward to a new age, or another way you could think about it, prophecy does call for faithfulness to the covenant law, looking back, and in doing so criticizes the existing order in light of God's call. And this class looks to the law and this class of prophets looks to the law and the fulfilling of the law, the fulfilling of God's reign, which Christians see in Jesus. So it's looking back, it's looking forward, it's all based upon faithfulness to God. This classification also reminds us of the importance of genre and the purpose of each book. Remember, these books weren't particularly written just for us, right? We weren't in mind for the biblical authors. So it points to the importance of understanding the genre of what we're reading in order to understand how to interpret whatever it is that we're reading in the Bible. So the importance of understanding genre, so we know what we're reading. So these classifications may help us do that, but we can't rely on them alone. Actually, we need to read the various books and try to discern genre and purpose as a whole, but also we need to discern genre even within each book, because not each book is like always historical. There's poetry in some, like the Song of Deborah that we're going to come across. So we always need to be asking, what are we reading? And what is the purpose or purposes of the particular book that we're reading? Keep in mind, for example, what are called historical books. The historical books are not history in the modern sense, as we've already talked about in previous classes. These books primarily have a theological purpose. So how the story is told is shaped by that theological faith purpose. Different audiences, different purposes. You can compare 1 and 2 Kings, for example, with 1 and 2 Chronicles. Example to that case, 1 and 2 Chronicles, for example, is much more detailed about some events in 1 and 2 Kings, and at other times leaves out parts of the stories as told in 2 Samuel and 2 Kings. For example, in 1 Kings, King Asa, A-S-A, gets less than a chapter. In 2 Chronicles, he gets 3 chapters. Example 2, David's adultery with Bathsheba and his order to have Uriah, her husband, killed, and the rape of David's daughter Tamar and Absalom's rebellion, all in 2 Samuel chapters 11 to 19, are completely omitted in 1 and 2 Chronicles when they're talking about David. So what's being told, how it's being told, it's all being shaped by the theological purpose of the author and the editors. Third example, compare 2 Samuel 24:1 to 1 Chronicles 21:1. So 2 Samuel 24:1 to 1 Chronicles 21:1. 2 Samuel 24:1 says, "Again the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, 'Go and take a census of Israel and Judah.'" That's 2 Samuel 24:1. In 1 Chronicles 21:1, same incident, it says, "Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel." So which is it? God or Satan? Chronicles apparently doesn't want God inciting David to take the census that led to Israel's punishment. And there's more examples. Check 266 to 268 in your textbook. So the Bible always offers, when it's offering kind of in these historical stories, it's always offering that history as shaped by theology. The story is told for theological purposes. It's not overly concerned with literal historical detail. The Bible as a whole is theological. It's a faith document. It's recording people's experiences with God as they've experienced things in their lives and how they're hoping to shape the community around that experience. So it's never disinterested or neutral history. There is no such thing, actually, even in history books that we have that are called history books now. It's really just true for all history. It's never disinterested. Sometimes it's trying to be objective, but objectivity itself is a commitment. So in the Bible, we are reading a theological interpretation and framing and organizing of events and experiences in which the author sees and talks about the presence of God. So you'd have to ask, is faith true? Well, of course. For those of us who are people of faith, this is the truthful telling of how God was experienced and active in the lives of these people. But we're always going to have to be pushing for what's the faith purpose behind this? See if we can figure that out. Okay, what's prophecy? The Hebrew word navi calls is those who are called or one who proclaims. They speak hard words of judgment / accountability and call for a change of life, including a change of how life is organized politically, economically, and religiously. Walter Brueggemann, in an excellent book called The Prophetic Imagination, says, the task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. Prophets see things differently. They're committed to the truth, and they want to share that truth for the sake of the conversion of the people, the change of economics, the change of politics, and the change of religious life and practice. So let's turn now to the former prophets. And we're going to do kind of a quick survey of each of these books. And then when I come back next week, we will have time to have a little bit more discussion about this. So Joshua, we want to ask, what's the theological purpose? This is theological history. For what purpose? Well, it's very much shaped by that Deuteronomic history. The former prophets as a whole reflect the concerns of the Deuteronomic theologians, biblical writers, and editors. Now, what's their concerns? They want to present history as a theological moral lesson. The moral of the story is, when Israel is faithful to God, they will prosper. When Israel is not faithful to God, they will suffer defeat. The prophets are going to say faithfulness to covenant means life, unfaithfulness to covenant means death. Staying in good relationship with God as the source of life means you will flourish. Cut your relationship with God, cut our relationship with God as the source of life, and we will die. It's that simple. Deuteronomy 30:19 kind of sums this up for us in the book that comes before these former prophets. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19. So if Israel does right, they will be blessed. If they do wrong, they will be cursed. If Israel does right, they will flourish. If Israel does wrong, they will perish. So these books are looking back at the story of Israel to try and make sense of why Israel was ultimately defeated, the temple destroyed, and the people are sent into exile. How does that happen? How is that possible? God is on our side. God is our God. God is all powerful. God is the God. How did we end up in exile? It's a theodicy question. Why do bad things happen to, well, in this case, not good people, people who have violated the covenant repeatedly in a variety of ways? Note that they do all of this kind of looking back. It's not just the history of the kings, especially in Joshua. There is no king. It's a history of the people. This is a people's history. So Joshua, in this Deuteronomistic view of history, Joshua is the prime example of doing right, who represents the whole people. He meditates on the law day and night, for then you shall make your way prosperous, Joshua 1:8. He's to be an inspiration for the people returning to the land after exile. Remember, this is a story that is being used for people who are coming back from exile to look back at sort of one of their founding fathers, just as like with Moses and Abraham, and to learn from them. Be strong and courageous is not just being said to Joshua. It's being said to the people of Israel who are returning to a land that's been decimated, and they're returning after exile. Be strong and courageous. Joshua 1:7, 1:9, 1:18, Joshua 23:6. You know, when you see repetition, when you read repetition, you know it's a theme. See that complete history, that complete summary of the history of the people of Israel in chapter 24 of Joshua. It's a nice, succinct, both hands up there, nice, succinct summary of the history. Joshua's the new Moses. He takes on the leadership in the spirit of Moses, the call of God, Joshua 1:3 and 3:7. Joshua 4:14, that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him all the days of his life, just as they stood in awe of Moses. Crossing the Jordan is like crossing the Red Sea. It's a crossing from sort of trial and struggle to freedom and flourishing. Joshua's vision is like Moses at the burning bush. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy. Joshua 5:13 to 15. So this new generation now is supposed to faithfully reflect the past generation of the Exodus generation, but avoid their mistakes. So that's the circumcision, Passover, manna, and the manna stops in chapter 5 of Joshua. It's all signs of coming home. Now let's look at some particular details in this great book of Joshua. Rahab, she's an ancestor of Jesus. She's one of the 5 women mentioned in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. The others are Tamar, the wife of Judah, Rahab, the wife of Solomon, Ruth, the wife of Boaz, Bathsheba, the wife of King David, after being the wife of Uriah, and Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, other than Mary, Rahab is the only one mentioned again in the New Testament in James chapter 2:24, where she's shown as an example of someone justified by God and declared righteous for putting their faith into action. Okay, now that's one of the things we need to think about in Joshua. The other is, how exactly did the Israelites come to take the promised land? Your book talks about 4 theories of conquest. And at the heart of all of these is a strong and persistent memory that the people of Israel were not and had never been inhabitants of the land. It's a promised land. This historical core, this would have been something tempting to try and cover over. Like they want to claim that's their land. It's easier to say this was our land from the very beginning, but they don't try to do that. So there's theory 1, there's a blitzkrieg, lightning war, quick conquest as it's described in those opening chapters of Joshua is literally true. Theory 2 was a slow contest, or a fast invasion but a slow conquest. Theory 3, no conquest. They just moved in peacefully. All 3 of these are problematic, as the archaeological evidence doesn't support the view that the Israelites had a distinctive cultural presence in this land in the time in which is described in the book of Joshua. Theory 4 is fascinating. It says this was really a peasant revolt. Most of the people who came to identify themselves as Israelites came from Canaanite stock. The Exodus group was a small group that came in and fostered rebellion among the Canaanite overlords. So, what to conclude? All of these point to the stories in Joshua serving stronger theological reasons or purposes rather than, as we've been saying, straight up history. This land is from God, that's a theological purpose, and God's power, not the strength of the Israelite military, is how they came into the land and how they hold the land. It's remarkable. They don't say it's through a king or a monarchy. It's through this charismatic leader, Joshua. He's not a king. He's not anointed. His authority is not hereditary, and his authority is not handed on to his sons. So, and we'll say more about some of that in a little bit. Now, what do we do with these stories of the ultimate, utter destruction of places like Jericho and the genocide of the people of Canaan? For example, Joshua 6:21. Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. Not even the donkeys are spared. Same thing in Joshua chapter 8, 18 to 26. It's just an utter destruction. How can God, the creator of the whole world, this loving and just God, select one race of people to slaughter another race of people and to do it without mercy? Does God authorize genocide? This raises the question of how do we deal with these troubling texts in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. So here's a response, part one. We're not reading these historically or literally. We're seeking the purpose of the authorship of Joshua, of the book of Joshua. So we don't read them historically. We already know that the events given as history in Joshua are not literally true. We know that from internal consistencies. Compare Joshua 10 to 11, chapters 10 and 11, total and complete conquest, with Joshua in chapter 11:16 to 12:24, 13:1 to 13, 23:1 to 24:3, and Judges 1, in which parts of Canaan are still not conquered, even after it says they've conquered the whole land. There's kind of these disconnects that are going on in the book of Joshua. Like specifically, look at Joshua 10:40 to 42. Joshua defeated the whole land, the hill country, etc., defeated them from here to there, everywhere. And then Joshua 13:1. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, "You are old and advanced in years, and very much of the land still remains to be possessed." It's right there in the book. There's also the archaeological evidence. For example, did the walls of Jericho come tumbling down? Evidence is that, yes, the walls did come down, but about 1,000 years before Joshua lived. The city of Ai, Jericho, conquered in Joshua 7-8, was uninhabited. That's not Jericho. Ai, conquered in Joshua 7-8, was uninhabited at the time of Joshua. So, quote from Kaminsky and Lohr on 110 in your book, most scholars today believe that the process by which Israel grew into a distinct people living in Canaan took longer than and involved a more complex set of factors than the portrait drawn by the book of Joshua suggests. Remember, the book is not written by people who were current with Joshua. It's written by people many, many hundreds of years later after Joshua, looking back and saying, let's tell the story of our ancestors in the faith. So what really happened? The Canaanites are not totally subdued until the time of David, which we read in 2 Samuel chapter 5. So the theological purpose, this book is not intending to report a strict factual history. The book's violent images, remember that's what we started with this discussion, what do we do with all this violence, this bloodshed, likely function as metaphors to explore what being a true Israelite who is devoted to God means. It means to be a true Israelite is courageous and strong in God. They're to be faithful as Joshua was faithful. Then God will fight for them. You have an ideology of conquest long after the Israelites came into this land. So the book of Joshua is portraying an ideal Israel under an ideal leader. The idealization was, in fact, a critique of the current kings of Israel who were immoral and unwise and led Israel into being conquered and then to fall into exile. So it's metaphorical. The violence is metaphorical. Well, that's okay unless you're a literalist, and then that's really problematic. But even as a metaphor, this is dangerous, right? We have violent metaphors like we think of when we talk about sports, like we slaughtered them or we killed them. The problem is, sometimes these violent metaphors kind of bleed over into justifying violence. So we've still got to be careful about these troubling texts. What do we do with them? Eric Siebert, in his book Enjoying the Old Testament, A Creative Guide to Encountering Scripture. Eric Siebert, Enjoying the Old Testament, A Creative Guide to Encountering Scripture, talks about three kinds of troubling texts in Numbers and Joshua, Judges, on and on, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings. There are texts here that are going to offend our moral convictions and sensibilities. The horrible treatment of women, the slaughter of people, the genocide. So that's one kind of text. There's texts then also related to that conflict with our view of God. Does God really command genocide? Is God as harsh and as judging and punishing as is presented in these books? These are texts, too, that have been used to harm other people. They've been used to justify the exploitation and harm of women, to be anti-foreigner, and to provide support for holy wars, for genocide, for example, against Native Americans. So what do we do with these things? How do we read them? First of all, we should be honest. If we're not bothered by some of the stuff that we're reading in the Old Testament, we're really not paying attention. We're just sort of gliding over things. Oh, well, that's just in the Bible, and that's the way it is. No, we should be bothered. If we're people of conscience, people formed in a good humanity, we should be bothered. And if we're followers of Jesus Christ, we'd certainly be bothered. It's fine to criticize parts of the Old Testament from the standpoint of Jesus. There's a long line of faith people who protested against apparent divine activity that seemed out of line with God's character. Think of Abraham, Moses, Job, the psalmists, and don't forget Jesus. So it's okay to be critical. That's part of being a person of faith. But what's our criteria for criticism? I think it's helpful for those of us who are Christian faith to have a sort of hermeneutical principle of the overall thrust of the Bible plus the thrust of Jesus Christ. So we start with the rule of love. Does this passage, text, interpretation enhance our love for God and others? Good question to ask. A rule of justice. Does this passage, text, interpretation help us to set things right, to lead to human flourishing, to be more faithful to God? And then a rule of respect for human life. Does this passage, text, interpretation respect and value all people? So a rule of love, of justice, and of respect for life. So as we think through, we do the sort of grown-up and maturing faith questions, we realize that not every portrayal of God in the Old Testament accurately reflects God's character. In fact, sometimes the stories may be preserved to help us to see how we ought not to believe in God. Israel doesn't always get God right. Sometimes what's preserved in the Bible is to show us how not to go. Christians should understand this since we already don't take into our lives all that there is in the Old Testament, like all those detailed laws in Leviticus. Christ, again, is the hermeneutical key for Christians. So what do? We need to wrestle with these texts. Don't let them go until they bless us. Dig deeper. There's more going on than just the bad stuff. What else may we learn? For example, from the war text, the underlying theological conviction that our security is not in our own hands, but in God's hands might be back there to learn. Sometimes what we learn is that this is not the way of God. So we can learn from a negative example. We name what's troubling and identify how we need to avoid the same today. Second, we can look for positive insights and explore questions raised by troubling texts. That is, what we see is violence leads to more violence. We can ask, does this text reflect cultural context more than God? Third, we can let the trouble make us go deeper into questions of war, women, oppression of those who are different. Fourth, let the Bible interpret the Bible. Bring troublesome texts into conversations with other texts, i.e. the patriarchal texts, put them into conversation with the stories of strong and heroic women that are also in the Hebrew Bible. Remember, the Bible doesn't speak with just one voice. So the Christian reading of Joshua, what might we take from Joshua? The metaphor of struggle in the journey of faith. Think of that great song, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah. When I tread on the verge of Jordan, bid my anxious fears subside. Death of death and hell's destruction, land me safe on Canaan's side. Songs of praises, I will ever give to thee. So we make this story of Joshua our story, which is what the biblical authors wanted in the first place. Only now it's our spiritual struggle to be faithful to God. Choose this day, but as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Joshua 24. Many tribulations to go through, the difficulty of life's journey. Then Joshua gathers the whole community together in the presence of God. Joshua 24, 14 to 15. Now therefore, he says, revere the Lord and serve God in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods of your ancestors, the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Now, if you are unwilling to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And then the people gave their testimony, and they said, therefore, we will also serve the Lord, for he is our God. Joshua 24:18. Okay, so that's Joshua. What about Judges? What's the major storyline there? Israel's living within Canaan, living next to the Canaanites, being corrupted. So we've got sort of a palace versus people duality also going on. The people conquered the promised land, settled in, and now they're being constantly attacked by foreign aggressors. So what does God do? God raises up judges, hence the title of the book. Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah and Barak, Gideon, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson, all these judges. Some get a fair amount of attention, and they're great stories, long stories like Samson, Judges 13-16. Others are barely mentioned. But this is the story of the confederation that ruled Israel after taking control of the promised land. Each one of these judges is flawed in some way. What's the underlying theological point? The key here is faithfulness to God, and God saves the people of Israel without a king. There's also a storyline of women in Judges. Not all pretty. That is, the stories are not pretty. Judges chapter 1, 12-15. Caleb, who's one of the judges, puts his daughter Aksha up as a prize for whoever conquers Hebron. Her very name means toy or trinket. Judges 11, Jephthah. His mother was a prostitute. His father was Gilead. As a son of a prostitute in Gilead, his vow is that if he wins a battle, the person who comes out to greet him will be killed. His daughter is the one who comes out to greet him. Judges 11, 29-40. So the daughter, why is she there? What's she modeling? Maybe she models what happens to women when they accept crazy male leadership. Judges 19-20, the angry concubine. It's a very sick story. A woman flees her Levite husband, returns to her father's house for protection. Her father gives her back to the Levite, and on the way home, to protect himself, she's given to be raped, then cut up and served as a call for revenge. Troublesome text. We'll have to wrestle with that one when we gather in class. Judges 21, the daughters of Shiloh. What happens when you live between two warring cultures and bear the pain of being caught between warriors? These women are just given over to the Benjamites. Judges 14, Samson and a Timnite woman. Samson is seeking a pretext to go and battle the Philistines. Judges 14:4. So it's a very strange set of stories here. It's got a lion with honey and a riddle. And that riddle of out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet, and they have to figure it out. And they do figure it out because someone tells them. And it's the Timnite woman. And Samson says, if you had not plowed with my heifer. So then he gives the woman, his wife, to a companion, his best man. Judges 14:20. Weird stuff. What do we get out of Judges at the end? In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. This is setting the stage for the palace history. Joshua and Judges is kind of the people's history, and then we're going into the palace history, taking center stage in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So let's turn to that now. 1st and 2nd Samuel tell the events that lead up to Israel's transition from a confederation to a monarchy under Saul, and then from Saul to David. What's the theological purpose here? All the kings are to be evaluated from the Deuteronomic perspective. Are they loyal/faithful to God? Some kings are kind of good, some are bad. Raises a more fundamental ongoing debate that's going on within Israel. Do we even need a king to be a people? Or can we be a people without an earthly king? From the authors of the palace history, the state has a pragmatic political purpose to serve. It's a means to an end, and it becomes an end in itself, and it swallows up the nation, leaves nothing in its wake. And so what do we get by the time we get to 2 Kings 25:21? So all Judah was exiled from its land. Along the way, we're getting summaries of each king. We get the great story of Israel deciding whether or not to have a king. We want to be looking at those when we come back together. We also have those stories of Elijah and Elisha. So we're going to have to ask some questions about those. Got the big stories in 1st and 2nd Samuel, the story of Hannah and Samuel, the debate about getting a king, a monarch. That's in 1 Samuel 8 and 1 Samuel 12. Read those through and see what are they debating. Saul, what a perplexing character. Why was Saul chosen? What hopes were there for Saul, and why did Saul fall? All questions for us to be asking as we read. David, a complex and flawed hero. All sorts of interesting stories, and certainly he's not just the hero. He's a flawed character. David as a sinner, for example, the adultery with Bathsheba, and when he does a census of the people. What's the point of all these stories? We could look back and say, look, the people of Israel are bigger than the monarchy. They survive all this stuff. They move beyond it. So we want to keep that in mind. I'd also direct your attention to pay attention to the women. Pay attention to Hannah, play it in 1 Samuel 1, Abigail in 1 Samuel 25, the medium or the witch at Endor, 1 Samuel 28, Tamar, raped by Amnon, 2 Samuel 13, the women of Tekoa, sent by Joab, 2 Samuel 14, and Rizpah, fascinating story in 2 Samuel 21. So, 1st and 2nd Kings now. See, we're moving awfully fast. The storyline, Solomon's the king, then the split of the northern and the southern kingdoms. The northern, Ephraim, Israel, southern, Judah. Get Elijah and Elisha, the Babylonian exile. We're still got here the Deuteronomic history interpretation. Faithful to God, you're blessed. Unfaithful, you're judged. What about Solomon? He gets judged under that same principle. If you do good and are faithful to God, good things will happen. If you do bad, not faithful, then bad things will happen. And Solomon veers off at longer he's king. Fascinating stuff of the elimination of his rivals in 1 Kings 2, Solomon's wisdom story, 1 Kings 3, and then the role of the prophets. We're going to have to wrestle with some of those as we transition next week into the latter prophets. We're going to ask about Elijah and Elisha and what they might mean for us. So there we are, folks. A little bit longer than I had hoped, but still under 40 minutes. So we will see you next week, and I hope you have a good week. And don't forget to do the reading on your own, dig into some of those biblical texts, and then get ready to have a good discussion next Monday. Take care. Bye-bye.